You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. This is a bonus episode, which I'll be releasing as soon as possible because I want to make you aware of a conference on spiritual abuse that is happening Saturday, June 5th. And I have as my guest today, Rachael Clinton Chen, who is teaching the conference. Rachael, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's really good to be here with you.
We're going to talk today about the subject of the conference, spiritual abuse, what it is, how to know if you've experienced it, etc. But first, Rachael, will you just tell people like the basic conference details, when it's happening, how to sign up, all that stuff?
So the conference is called Confronting Spiritual Abuse. It will be held online in a virtual format on June 5th. Honestly, this event is for anyone who's been impacted by spiritual abuse, discerning if they've been impacted by spiritual abuse. I think if you are working with people and you find I'm encountering this a lot, it might be helpful just to hear more about it. It is $69 and it will be recorded. And so if you're not able to make it that day, the recording will be available until September 5th. So it'll be available for the summer months. You can go back and watch it. And the best way to sign up is to go to theallendercenter.org, and there's a little events link. And if you click on that, it's the very top event, and there's a little registration link or like a little purchase link.
Let's begin with just a definition. This is heavy duty stuff. And maybe we can start with some words about what do we mean by spiritual abuse, Rachael?
Some of the most basic way to understand spiritual abuse is the use of religion or spiritual power and authority to control, coerce, or perpetrate harm. It really is a distortion or exploitation of God's power and authority and those who claim that to manipulate and control, and often manipulate and control bodies, personhood, relationships, and autonomy. And the primary tools of spiritual abuse are fear and shame. And so, again, it's this kind of marriage of religious or spiritual authority that's being used to maintain power and control in really abusive ways. And what can be really tricky about it is that it's often an umbrella for multiple, like maintaining and perpetrating all kinds of other abuse. So often in a spiritually abusive system, you're going to see emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. It's like all those things are probably going to be playing out because it's a system that is abusing power, and not just any kind of power, like God power. And there can be spiritually abusive systems and organizations like churches and nonprofits, schools. A lot of people have stories of being in maybe private religious schools that had a lot of spiritual abuse, or spiritually abusive people that are leaders, pastors, but also parents. A lot of people have experiences of families, a family system that might be a part of a larger spiritually abusive context, but maybe a lot of the spiritual abuse they experienced was coming primarily from a parental figure. I think what is probably the most insidious thing to me about spiritual abuse is that it's an incredibly powerful form of grooming, because who wants to be cut off from God? And when truths about God, theologies and textual interpretations of the Bible are being given to you by someone who's claiming an authority that is kind of ultimate and bigger and better than like your sense of God, that can be a really persuasive, powerful kind of manipulation. And it can really range from like the subtle, I say subtle, I don't know if this would fall into subtle, but a lot of times people will talk about the purity movement of the late 80s and early 90s as being a more subtle form of spiritual abuse, because it likely had good intentions, like this desire to provide a context for young people to protect something really sacred. But the ways in which it was manifested and like instilled and moved, it was very spiritually abusive, because it really had some bad theology mixed up in it. And so a lot, you can find some books that are written about that form of spiritual abuse on our sexuality and our bodies. But I think that's just one more thing I'll name, and then I'll take a breath and let you ask me some questions. But I think that that's also that sense of it is deeply embodied. And that's what can be confusing, because we think about something like spiritual abuse and we think about it as being just a mind control. And it certainly involves a manipulation and kind of an authoritative kind of power of your mind, but it is also a kind of control of your body. And it's deeply embodied, because so many of these spiritual realities for us, these rituals of our faith, are deeply embodied practices.
So you've just said so very much, so many words that need to be kind of unpacked. When you say embodied, when you say that spiritual abuse is embodied, what does that mean?
Because spiritual abuse is often this element of control and fear and shame. We don't experience fear and shame just in our minds. Like those are palpable physical experiences that we don't want to experience. So we will do anything in our power to try to avoid the experience of shame. So if someone is using shaming tactics to keep you in line, to keep you loyal, to keep you quiet, then that's a very physical experience of something. And also, so much of our spirituality is happening in communities. So if someone is using fear to keep you as a part of the community, oftentimes the fear is, if you step out of line, if you question this belief, if you question authority, you will be cut off from this community, maybe from your family, and oftentimes like you're going to be cut off from God. Those aren't just thoughts we have. Those can be deeply physical, relational. That's like a terrifying place to be.
And we feel those things in our chest, in our gut, in our throat. You feel the threat, whether it's verbalized or not.
Right.
You feel in your body a sense of, I cannot think for myself. I cannot ask certain questions. I can't even wonder about certain questions because
Right.
in that sense, I am risking being kicked out, if not officially, informally, excluded from relationships that are really quite important to me.
Right.
And that's all part and parcel of spiritual abuse.
Absolutely.
So, I think that every story of spiritual abuse is necessarily unique in its devastation, but we can bullet out some of the elements of it. And you've already done that, but let's just slow down and kind of just let's just bullet out, what are in your mind, Rachel, some of the core elements of spiritual abuse?
Honestly, I think one of the key components of spiritual abuse is often a inferred or explicitly determined distrust of our own bodies. That our bodies are bad, they are sinful, they are not to be trusted, our emotions are only deceitful, and ultimately any kind of wisdom that we might claim to come from ourselves can't be trusted unless it's being vetted and affirmed by someone in spiritual power or authority or leadership.
You are, and we'll get to this in a minute. You don't, this is not just academic for you. You have
No.
familiarity with this personally. But what you're putting words to right now, even for, I'm just thinking for listeners that have experienced spiritual abuse, like it's hard to stay present even as you're putting words to this.
Yeah.
And that's part of the assault of evil
Yeah.
through spiritual abuse. It is very hard to follow even an explanation of it because something within us fragments and dissociates. When you're putting words to something that was so insidious and subtle in the sense that it flew under the radar, like a kid that's being hit by their father knows it.
Yeah.
But someone who is being spiritually abused by those in authority in their local church, family, organization, very often has no idea that it's happening until years later.
I mean, I think it's similar where like we could probably make the case, even sometimes when we're talking with someone who's being hit, if it's your normal, if it's the air you breathe, if it's all you know, then it does take almost either just that breaking point where you leave or you're exiled. And usually those are really horribly painful experiences. Or you have a different taste and a different experience that actually helps create some of that like tension of like, whoa, that was something. And I do think this is really these are such painful places, and they can be really extreme. People coming out of more cult like experiences that can say very explicitly, okay, yeah, that was spiritually abusive, to people who are going, well, this is how the Bible was taught to me. This is what I thought it meant to be obedient in, and faithful in a kind of my faith practices, even as I'm like slowly dying inside and pretty much only feel like I just must not be good at this. And I think for me, when I'm working with people who are struggling to name reality as a spiritual abuse, they often bring stories of their faith life and their church life that's like, I just wasn't very good at the thing. Like I couldn't ever be what was being asked of me to be. I was bad. I was too afraid. I didn't have a lot of faith in God. I think because it's something that's happening in the context of spiritual formation, how we engage the Bible. And again, in some of our core primary relationships, it's similar to being in a family system. None of us can really bear to feel the truth of certain things because it might mean we can't stay or we don't get to keep it. And especially if it's happening from a young age when we're children, and it's just, again, the air we breathe, it does take a really long time to find language for, I don't think that was actually, like, I don't even know if the God I've been told about is God.
For someone who cares as deeply about God as many of the listeners do, that's a very disorienting place to arrive at. This sense of, I don't know if the God that I have been relating to is actually God.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of maybe my perception is off, because this is where spiritual abuse gets so pernicious. A fundamental attribute of it in my mind is a deep distrust of one's gut,
Absolutely.
a deep distrust of one's heart. And for me, in my story, it was Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. And that verse became a sledgehammer to distrust my heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I say that verse, Rachel, what happens in you in this context?
Well, one, I feel that in my body. And I also feel that kind of shaking rage that says that, like, anytime we're taking a text out of like a part of scripture out of the context of the story it's a part of, that can be spiritually abusive. So in some ways you're bringing a very text that the way it's utilized to create distrust of our personhood and the desires that we're made with, so that we question everything we feel. And our gut is a truth teller. Our bodies are truth tellers. And I just think back to, like, Jesus is constantly honoring people's personhood and giving them back like authority. I mean, he's often, when he's engaging healing of people, he asks for their authorization.
Mm-hmm.
And he's often lifting them in these places in the margins, sociopolitically, religiously. He's lifting them to a status that is like a reintegration into community where they've been isolated. So when I think about spiritually abusive leaders or context, I think we are in the realm of John 10:10, of wicked leaders. The thief, the sheep, the thief who is not the good shepherd, who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And we get to be in some ways born again with the good shepherd who comes to bring life and life abundant. Again, we both know, we work in our own stories, in our own context, that trauma does distort our desires, does distort our faith and our hope and our love. So we're not making a claim that everything you feel is ultimately true. But to start with this baseline that your heart is only deceitful, that the ways you feel, the ways you think, the ways you see just can't be trusted at all is so anti-gospel and is actually so antithetical to who God has created us to be as image bearers. So you got to tell the whole story and you got to let these things be held in the larger story. I think spiritual abusers are brilliant at both creating trauma and then using trauma to be the ones to provide the solution. When you have been in this kind of context of someone basically using division and increasing fragmentation by us versus them, be afraid, but then using dogma and right belief as the thing to bring cohesion. As if you just believe rightly and get in line with these very kind of rigid ideas and rules versus about who's in and who's out, that will mend your fragmentation.
And it appeals to hurting hearts to be included.
Oh, goodness. How much do we see this playing out in our culture right now? The charismatic leader who's using fear and hatred to create a scapegoat to rally people against, but also that fear that keeps them afraid of ever being the scapegoat or of ever being outside of the boundary lines. And again, just this use of isolation, kind of like, you got to be loyal to me and to this spiritual community above all others.
We can't talk about spiritual abuse without hearing the word power pulsing. I mean, it's fundamentally about power.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma makes us feel a sense of powerlessness that makes us, tragically so ripe for future spiritual abuse. And
Yeah.
so we have to remember the mind of a child, of a 10-year-old, of a 15-year-old, of an adolescent. We're trying to make sense of our world.
Yeah.
And we are hungry for belonging and welcome. And if we have a history of trauma, that's on steroids.
Yeah.
And then a charismatic leader comes along. And I don't mean like JFK. I just mean somebody with some measure of charisma in your local community comes along and paints a picture of home,
Mm-hmm.
of welcome and inclusion for you and your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something inside every adolescent. And by adolescence, I mean, I'm talking about a 30-year-old. It extends to 32 for men. So for somebody hungry for that, it is almost impossible not to jump. If you're hungry for truth and for love and for God, not to jump at that invitation
Yeah.
and begin to experience what starts out as a balm to your hurting heart.
Especially if the kind of promise of safety is a part of that. Like, this is a safe place. There's order here. There's, goodness here. Like, if you've known a lot of chaos, known just a lot of disorder,
Yes.
then someone presenting as very put together, as godly, as like, this is a safe place, that partnering with belonging, with, we teach the truth here.
And a theological system, I don't care what system it is an ordering of the cosmos. And far more, it is an ordering of your experience on the planet. It makes sense of your experience in a particular way, and that grounds you. And even if it is harmful, it still grounds you. We have to hold, I think, Rachel, in tension the devastation of spiritual abuse and at the same time that makes so much sense why you would have gravitated towards that.
There has to be so much grace and mercy. So I'm so grateful you're naming that, because again, so much, one of the primary tools of spiritual abuse is shame and fear. And shame is always traumatic. So if you've known trauma and then you're in a context that in some ways is just exploding that trauma, but initially it feels good and like a safe place and a place of belonging, to wake up to that is excruciating. And I think your language of disorienting is really important to name. And that's why people will often message me. I feel like I'm waking up to the fact that I'm in a spiritually abusive marriage, a spiritually abusive religious situation. What do I do? And sometimes that takes time. And it can't be like an immediate cutting off of everything, because it's too painful, it's too threatening, it's too scary. I just think that Jesus is a more kind and provides. And also, I think Jesus meets us in the wilderness. I know Jesus meets us in the wilderness. I know that being born again as a healing process, it takes time and it's messy, and yet so incredibly powerful too. The more people enter that healing process, the more they find like sojourners and others who are with them, that they aren't alone. They don't have to go it alone. They don't have to navigate the wilderness without lots of seasoned guides who, again, it's that tricky thing, right? Because if part of what you're dealing with is spiritual abuse, you don't want to just trust any leader. You don't want to just trust any person, because that's the setup. You can't even trust yourself to like discern if someone's safe, because you're trying to figure out how you could have stayed so long in a context that's brought so much harm.
I'm just aware, even Rachel, as we're talking about so many different facets of spiritual abuse,
Yeah.
that there's a fire hose kind of experience in listening to an episode like this. But at the conference, you are going to take people through, you don't need to outline it, but can you just, what are you going to take people through?
Yeah, we're going to spend some time unpacking, what do we mean by spiritual abuse? In some ways, some of the things we've been doing here, but probably a little more slow. What are some of the core, both like realities of spiritual abuse, but then what are some of the core experiences of spiritual abuse that help you discern, is this something I've experienced or not? And I think part of that's important, right? Because when you're talking about something that has to do with power, there are power dynamics everywhere we turn. So you have to unpack that a little bit, because not all power is inherently bad. But when you've experienced spiritual abuse, it can feel that way, right?
Right.
So we'll spend some time really nuancing that. But we're also going to spend a lot of time talking about what are the hallmarks of a spiritually abusive culture in kind of the various forms. What is kind of the setup for those of us who would be most drawn to it, and why are we drawn to it? So getting into some of that compassion of like, how do our stories in some ways set us up to be more susceptible to spiritual abuse? But I'm honestly going to spend a majority of the time talking about, what does healing from spiritual abuse look like? What is something of the texture of that healing journey, which will look different for every person. So we're going to spend a lot more time talking about what does the healing journey look like, and getting into what does healing for the body look like? How do you restore trust in the gut? And how do you have any kind of faith practice if so many of the things and ways you've practiced your faith might need to be suspended for a season? But I do find it's helpful to have some language around healing, and also just talking a little bit more about what are some of the hallmarks of not a like perfectly healthy spiritual community or spiritual leader, but what are some of the ways and tools you can use to just hang on to be able to discern, especially when no community is going to be free of being human. Every community is going to have very human size realities and problems and kind of our complexities that come with being incredibly broken and incredibly beautiful people. But I think there are some discerning tools to be able to go, this might be a human-sized community, but I don't necessarily have to be afraid of spiritual abuse.
So I'm in no way asking you to share more of your story than you wish, but I know you're not interested in this merely for academic reasons. We tend to become interested in spiritual abuse because we've experienced it.
Yeah.
How has that been true for you, and how has your own journey kind of informed what you're going to be speaking about on June 5th?
One of the things I love about that question is up until probably 4 years ago, this is not a term I would have used.
Right.
You've heard so many of my stories in different Allender Center contexts. They are ripe with spiritual abuse, but it's not a phrase I would have used. Now, it's interesting because I've always felt a strong call to ministry, but I've always been very critical of so many of the ministry contexts I've been in as I became an adult and established, I got through education, a lot of learning, a lot of questions, better questions to ask. So I found myself in this trauma work primarily out of, like you said, these deep questions of necessity. Like, I think the best theologians come to their theological work out of blood, sweat, and tears. Like, I have to wrestle with these questions because my life depends upon it. So I would have said to you, I care about trauma informed pastors. I would have said to you, I care about people getting asked. This is how I would have phrased it as a part of my calling. I know I'm called to help people have access back to their own bodies and hearts and minds, and therefore access back to God and access to relationships. Never would have used the phrase spiritual abuse. Dan asked me to do a podcast with him on spiritual abuse, and I was like, sure, I'll do that with you. Like, whatever. I like, let's talk about it. I'm not really sure what that is or what it means, but like, yeah, sure, let's talk about it. And it was literally in the participation of this podcast, I started to share stories. And I could say probably it was a moment of anointing where the Spirit was like, all right, you haven't been ready for this, but now I'm going to open your eyes to your own reality. And it was like, as we were doing this podcast, all of a sudden I'm telling stories. And I have this terrifying, I can't even tell you what we talked about because I have a terrifying visceral connection that also felt like compassionate ministry alignment of like, this is my story. Like, I want to bring this to people because I need someone to bring it to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was telling this story of, I was raised in a very, I would say, somewhat healthy Christian context that was Southern Baptist when I was younger, with Sunday school teachers that when I said things like, I don't think I got saved, like, I'm still sinning. And they're like, well, salvation is a process. And also, like, you don't ask Jesus into your heart. Like, God is inviting you into God's kingdom and world. And it's going to take time to figure out what it means to be like a citizen of that world. And I'm like, oh, okay. But as I got older, my parents, we moved a lot for my dad's work, and we would just always go to Baptist churches. And so we ended up in a Southern Baptist church that I would just say was incredibly spiritual abusive, very dysfunctional. But again, I was a teenager. There wasn't those discerning frameworks, but it had all the hallmarks of, like, there were lots of very rigid views about women and the role of women. I saw women yelled at. And there were really dysfunctional power dynamics between men and women. So I have a story of being set up in a relationship with one of the youth leaders as a 16-year-old. And it took me a long time to name that as spiritual abuse among all the other abuses that were a part of that. But to name and understand, I was in a very spiritually abusive system. And ultimately, the way I got out of that was kind of I needed to reject the God of that system. I remember having to go talk to the pastor, like the senior pastor, about wanting to get out of this relationship as like a 16-year-old, and him drawing diagrams about how love never fails, love is patient, it doesn't give up, it perseveres. And so I started to have this sense of like, if I get out of this relationship, I'm breaking covenant with God, and I'll lose calling, I'll lose access to God. And so I stayed not because I really cared about what these people thought. I mean, I certainly did, but I mostly did not want to lose this sweet, dear connection I had with God and this sense of knowing I felt called to ministry. And ultimately I had to go, if this is what you want for me, God, because I kind of wanted to die. And I felt like I just was terrible at everything. And I had a ton of trauma manifesting that was only being reinterpreted as sin. You know, your fear and your anxiety is sin. I was working so hard to try to stay and be faithful to this. And I finally was just like, this is what you want from me? I don't want you.
But that requires an inordinate amount of ego strength for that young woman to do that. And it was a death for you, Rachel.
It was.
And it must have brought a terror into your life, even as you were seeking to address a terror in your life.
Oh, yeah. You know, I don't know how to make sense of the grace of God, even in these moments where I think God is screaming, I am fighting for you. I have not abandoned you. Like, you know, I will fight for you to get out of this prison. And, you know, I kind of got connected to some other pastors through friends, like a Mercy, right? Who were starting to very gently and playfully ask me questions that were starting to kind of like be like, okay, maybe there's other possibilities here. But yes, the terror was very real and the rage was very real. I think I needed a lot of anger in order to like
Yes.
fight to get out. So then I dealt with a lot of people telling me like, you're not being very godly. You're very angry right now and you're very rebellious. Yeah, you're very rebellious. You know, all of the things. But what I can say, and what's hard about this is I can't prescribe this as true for everyone, but the season that followed, the way God honored my like cry for deliverance was a very, I would say, very womb like being born again process where I just felt enveloped by a presence of God, almost like God was saying, I am going to show you who I am. And I am a God of love and freedom and life, and one who stands against every form of death and oppression. And it was a really sweet, restorative season, but that didn't lead to like an instant integration back into spiritual community. And that took a long season, I think, to find. And I kept bouncing back to spiritually abusive contexts because they were familiar.
Yes. And there is always an incredibly high social and emotional cost
Yeah.
to leaving spiritually abusive contexts.
Yeah.
And when we've already got trauma, we often do not have the ego strength, the trust in our own gut
Right.
to set out into the unknown and into the wilderness, because we are social animals. That's how God made us. And just because your relationships happen to be with a spiritually abusive community doesn't make those relationships any less precious to you.
Exactly.
And so I'm thrilled that you had a womb-like experience in the wake of leaving, but you still had to suffer the terror and the cost of leaving.
And the loss of relationship.
Yes.
And I think what can be devastating to me is I think so many people in these moments of the terror, the exposure, the feelings of exile feel like the only option then is to leave God altogether, is to leave faith altogether. And I make no judgments on that. Like, I think there has to be a profound mercy for that. But I think part of why I wanted to create this opportunity was to say for those people who are like, I could probably even give up some of this community, but I don't want to lose Jesus. And I'm scared. I'm scared if I start to look at this too deeply, will anything remain? will anything remain? And so that's part of why I want to spend some time talking about like where in the text, like the Psalms, as a place to start as a spiritual practice to get reacquainted with our gut as something that God, in saying, talk to me with honesty. I want to hear your heart. Like these songs of lament, these songs of rage, these songs of praise that are all together. Like, what are some of the places we get to go to that probably in some of our contexts haven't been invited as like places to wrestle and places to disrupt the shame and the complicity and the fear? So I wanted to offer some imagination for what does get to remain and how do we journey through the wilderness? How do we survive the terror, the disorientation?
What are some of the symptoms of spiritual abuse, Rachel? Like if somebody's listening, like, maybe, I don't know, do I have I experienced spiritual abuse? If they were to say, like, how can I kind of discern?
Mm-hmm.
I have some sense of maybe there was something there in that church or in this family or in this context. What are some of the ways, the symptoms?
Yeah. I would say again back to these sense of like how was fear and shame utilized? Um, how was the text handled? Was there any room for questioning? Was there room for doubt? Was there room for wonder? What was the role of isolation? Like who were you allowed to be in relationship with people very different from you without fear of being bad or fear of danger that somehow if you have relationship with someone who doesn't believe what you believe, they're going to suck you into their worldview. You'll have no sense of self or autonomy, and you'll be like swept off into the ocean of hell and despair. I think that's where I'd say, like, for me, it's how rigid were the boundary lines of where you were going to move outside of the love of God, either who you were relating with, the questions you asked, the behaviors in your world. Like, how rigid were the boundary lines of where the love of God, you were going to move beyond a capacity to receive the love of God. And oftentimes I think that's really where people have to look because they can go, oh my God, like I felt like it was a very thin line. That's when you know you're in a context that's not actually honoring your personhood. It's not honoring your complexity as a human being. Is giving you a God that is very fragile. Like, talk about ego strength, is presenting a very fragile and punitive God who often is made more in the image of a person than the actual image of God.
So self-doubt, an inability to question certain things. And I think we have to say that in many places, this is subtle. In other words, there's no announcement from the front of the church that you're not allowed to ask the following questions. It's the raised eyebrow of one of the elders when you risk putting a little bit of language to a question that you have. It's in the nonverbal communication, the ethos of the community that says, look, there are certain places that you're not to go or venture or wonder about. And there are certain people. I love how you put that out there about relation. There are certain people that are not us. There are certain people that are other and they're dangerous. They're dangerous to your soul to be in relationship with them. And that kind of ethos it's not always indicative of a spiritually abusive culture, but these are the kinds of traits that characterize spiritually abusive, power hungry leaders. I think it has to be said as leaders, because there's no spiritual abuse without spiritually abusive leaders. It requires power.
Yeah, and let's be honest, I think a lot of these contexts, and this was true in my context, those spiritual leaders who are dictating and controlling everyone else's behavior often are allowed to get away with all kinds of behavior because of this special authority they have. And so that you can't question, why did you do that? Because that's off limits. So though you might be getting kind of reprimanded for something, they are perfectly permitted to behave or respond in a way. And I do think it's that sense of where you've been named bad, divisive, unfaithful, disobedient. That's also often another characteristic of like, what kind of power dynamics are at play here?
Right. And it may not have happened to you. All you have to do is witness it happening to someone. And then you get the message and you get the fear in the cells of your body.
I don't want that.
I don't want that.
I will not make that mistake.
Right. And I think the trajectory of all spiritual abuse ultimately is to scapegoating. Would you agree with that, Rachel?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying is kind of this use of fear and hatred to maintain control. And we see that play out all throughout history. We see that playing out in our country today, when there's a capacity to scapegoat someone who is feared because they're threatening and dangerous. And therefore it is okay for you to hate them because God hates them too. So let's all come together. So I absolutely think where you are seeing scapegoating happening, which only reinforces the sense of, well, it's not like you're thinking, I don't want to be the scapegoat. You're thinking, I don't want to be hated. I don't want to be the person so bad we have to be terrified of them.
Right. Right. And in spiritually abusive communities, you will have a felt sense, if you start to push the boundaries, that if you go much further, and this might sound absurd, but it feels this way. Your life will be threatened.
Yeah.
And again, that might sound absurd, but to the person in it, I've experienced this. I know you've said it on the Elder Center podcast. It's a sense of, I'm going to die.
All right.
I'm going to die. It is an existential threat to your existence, because we are social creatures and we need community. And more than that, we need blessing. We need welcome. And the essence of scapegoating is curse. You are being labeled and named as bad, and you are being sent away. And your community, your former community, is going to galvanize and have commonality in their hatred of you or their fear of you.
Yep.
And that is a death to the soul.
Yep.
And it is terror. It's terror.
Absolutely. I think you've named that so well.
And so you're going to explore these things on June 5th. And people can sign up again at theallendercenter.org. Just click on the events tab and you can sign up for the conference. It's from 9 to 2 Pacific time. And people don't need to bear the entire 5 hours because there's a video. And so like you can attend. And if you need a break because it gets too intense, like I know Rachel well enough to know that you would bless them turning you off and muting you.
Absolutely. I get emails once a week. People saying, I listened to this one podcast you did. It gave language for something I felt, but I didn't have language for.
Right.
Are there more resources? So this is my attempt to just say, we've got to build a lot more resources for this.
Rachel, thank you not just for coming on the podcast today, but thank you especially for all of your labor leading up to June 5th and your preparation for putting words to very powerful, insidious, pernicious, difficult concepts, frankly, and realities. So thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And I would just say, if you can pray for me, even in this weird realm of spiritual abuse, even as weird as prayers, and I don't mean like right in this moment, I think I just mean as you're listening, if you can pray, because I do think this is a place of contending with, yeah, you're saying powers and principalities that can bear great fruit for the kingdom of evil by distorting what God intends for good and thriving. So thank you for partnering with me in this and for your good labor in this realm too.